the Trappings and Trinkets knitting podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole. I've closed the windows here today. It's super humid. It's the kind of weather that I'm pretty sure that my children are plotting to overthrow the parental regime because I've had the air off this week, and it's starting to get a little unbearable today. But it's supposed to be nice again next week, so anyway, I've got the ceiling fan on, so if I'm blowing, if I'm having a little Beyonce fan, that's what you're seeing. I should say, this is my favorite sundress that I've sewn. It's the same type of deal as the sundresses I've shown in previous podcasts. This was actually, well, no, this wasn't the first one I made. I think it was like the second one. I made a test sundress first out of fabric that I was not as much in love with, and then I made this one, and this is my favorite out of all of them. Not only because it's purple and has like squids or octopuses or some sort of cephalopod on it, but also because I like the shape. I like the fit. It turned out really well. So this is like, it's like legging, like yoga pant material. Not the silky yoga pants, but like the ones that are mostly cotton but have a little spandex in them. So this is super comfortable, and it's like wearing pajamas. This is by far the dress that I get the most comments when I wear because, I don't know, apparently people are not used to seeing grown women in octopus dresses or squid dresses. I don't know why. Anywho, to make this a little more formal, this outfit, I thought I'd wear some gloves today. These are my finished World War G gloves. And I made them a little bit longer than what it calls for in the pattern because I'm wanting to wear these outside when it's pretty chilly on some late fall evenings while I'm taking pictures at my kids' marching band invitational. So I wanted to be able to have my fingers out, but I also wanted to have as much coverage as possible. So I did make them right up to, middle digit or middle knuckle on my middle finger. So I like these because they have these little welts and they just kind of look very casual and squishy and comfy. So that pattern is available on Ravelry, World War G. And I do like the yarn that I used for these. It was a camel silk blend that I had picked up in Florida. It was Kismet Fiberworks, I think was the name or the brand. But I will say I do actually like the original yarn that I made the sample for the pattern. And in the last podcast, it was weird because I put like some titles on the bottom of the screen that said, hey, I forgot to tell you that this yarn actually has changed name, and the new name of it is L'Amour. But the movie making software stole my last title, so I think it just said like, and this yarn has changed names. And then it didn't give you the last title of what the new name was. So if you are actually interested in making them in the yarn that the pattern calls for, the yarn is called L'Amour. And I really need to change, or I need to put that note on the pattern page. So hopefully this will be the impetus to do that, because I think it changed names like 2 years ago. So anyway, those turned out really well, and I'm sure I will get lots of use out of them this fall because there will be lots of marching band. Another finished object that it totally slipped my mind to show you last week was this folded sweater that I had been working on with the blue is Hedgehog Fibers yarn, and the yellow is Knitted Wit Victory Fingering yarn. So I really do like how this turned out, and I'll put a video, or I'll put a little insert here of me wearing it so that you can see it a little bit better. Folded! The only thing that I would do different, well, there's a couple things. So the first thing is that I was so excited to start on this sweater that I did not do the prep work that I should have done. This color I've knit with this color before in other yarns, other like indie hand dye yarns, and it bled like crazy. And so I had a hunch that probably I should do something to try to make sure that it wasn't going to bleed all over the other color that I was choosing. But I was impatient and I didn't do it. And so I thought, well, I was knitting. I was like, it's fine. I'll do it after it's all knit together. I'll figure out what to do. So I did, the first time I really washed it, I had like stuck it in water real quick to measure gauge just to get a little bath in it. But the first time I actually soaked it for a minute or so in the water, I put about a cup of white vinegar in a bath with maybe 6 or 8 cups of water. So it was fairly diluted. And I swished it around in there. I left it in there. I pulled it out, looked at the water. Water was totally clear. Put it back in, swished it around. I probably left it in there for a full minute or so. Took it out, dumped the water out. The water was 100% clear. So I thought, oh, great. I don't need to worry about it. Oh, by the way, in case you're not familiar, the vinegar is because the acid will help adhere the dye to the yarn. So that's why I used vinegar. So I thought, okay, great, this yarn isn't going to bleed. So I put it in another bath with some soak and water and swished it around. Now, I'm still watching it carefully because I don't trust this color. So I'm swishing that around, pulling it up. Oh, look, the water's blue. Dumped the water out, did a second bath with the soak and the water, left in there, turned the water blue. So what I'm going to do actually is I only used a cup of vinegar because that's all I had. So when I get to the store and buy some more vinegar, I will wash it in a less diluted vinegar bath and try that, and then wash it again in the water. So right now, it's actually very vinegar smelling, which actually a lot of hand-dyed yarn smells that way, or a lot of like regular company-dyed yarn smells that way. But if I wash it in the soak enough, the vinegary smell will come out. So anyway, obviously I didn't leave it in the water long enough for the yellow yarn to really get affected by the blue dye, and I will just be really, really careful not leaving it in the, like, there's certain sweaters that I will throw in a bucket of soapy water and walk away, and I'll leave it in there for 10 minutes or a half an hour, or maybe I'll get distracted and leave it in there for a few hours. I learned my lesson on sweaters that have more than one color in it, and I don't do that with those sweaters because of this lovely garment. This is something that I knit a number of years ago, probably 4 years ago. I think this sweater pattern is called Rock the Lobster, and it's a really nice color work sweater. It started out as a white and blue sweater. So this part was pure white, and I really liked how it looked. And I threw it in the wash. I think I had worn it once or maybe twice. Threw it in the bucket to wash it. Walked away, and I didn't walk away for a half hour. I might have walked away for 5 minutes. When I came back, the white yarn was blue, and there was no amount of rinsing that I could do to get that dye out. So, I mean, it's fine. Like, I still wear the sweater quite a bit, and it still looks nice, but it's not white and blue anymore. So, learn from my mistakes. Do not leave your color work garments in a wash bucket for very long. Oh, and that's another, I guess that's a tip that it didn't occur to me to give, but I keep talking about a wash bucket because I am lazy and I don't like to clean out my sink every time I want to do some hand wash laundry. So instead, I have a bucket that I just keep on the basement steps, and every time I want to hand wash something, I just fill up this bucket with my soak and water and throw the garment in there, and that way I can just do that and also have a sink full of dishes. So if you're lazy like me, you might just want to go to Target and buy a $5 bucket to use for your hand wash. Okay, so that was the first thing I would do, is if I had it to do again, I would maybe not be so impatient, and I would just soak the yarn in the skein in some vinegar, like vinegar solution, to really make sure that dye is adhering to the yarn, and then rinsing, putting it in the soapy water, rinsing, trying my best to get as much dye that's going to bleed off before I knit it into the garment. Okay, the second thing that I would do different is, you see this little gobbledygook here with the little gathered area? So that's the whole shaping to this, the front of the sweater. It has a fitted yoke and a drapey body to it, and it's all gathered right here. And if I had it to do over again, I would do that gathering within the blue, the big blue stripe, rather than doing it on a stripe that involved some yellow. So that was just my own being stupid. I should have realized that it would have been a lot more camouflaged had I done it in the blue. So, I mean, it's still fine. I will still wear it quite a bit, I think, but yeah, I mean, it's not my favorite look to have it a little garbled there in the gathering stripe. So anyway, a successful project for sure, and this one, I'll put on the screen here what size I made, because I don't remember offhand. I'm like a 38.5-inch bust, so I'm not really sure what size that corresponded to in the pattern. But it took 2 skeins of the hedgehog fiber sock yarn, and not a full, like, maybe a half skein, but I don't even think that much. Maybe like a third of a skein of the victory fingering for the stripe. So I'm really glad that I started again and did the double stripe with the yellow, because the ball I had of the blue yarn was like this big. When I was done with the whole sweater, that is all I had left from those 2 skeins. So I wouldn't have been able to finish the sweater. I would have had to cut the sleeve shorter, or the length on the body a little bit shorter, and that wouldn't have been ideal. So I'm very glad that I did the double stripe there and got a nice sweater out of just 2 skeins of the main color yarn. So very economical way to do your garments is to just buy a couple skeins and then to use something. I mean, I didn't use a scrap, but you totally could have used a scrap from your fingering yarn to just put some stripes in there. Maybe not everybody is the same size as me, but maybe your size is that you can use 3 skeins of the main color and then make up a little extra with some scraps from your stash. So it's a way to use up some of your stash. Those are my 2 finished objects, and then I've got a couple of things in progress. Last time I showed you, I think, 1 sock. I've been working on some shorty socks from this other fun hedgehog yarn. I decided to do 2, they're very, very similar, but the heels are actually a little different. If you look carefully, you can see those. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the heels in next week's podcast. I'm going to try to get either some sock blockers or just cut out some feet shape things, or I don't know. Somehow I'll show you better what these heels look like. And then when I have a little more time, I'll talk more about those. But in the meantime, I want to try a sock pattern that I just saw on Ravelry, and it's called No-Show Socks. And the reason I'm interested is because I do like these socks, but these, because they're ankle socks and they're made of wool, they're not the stretchiest, grippiest ankles. So if you buy store-bought cotton socks, they have a lot of elastic in them, and they do grip around your ankle very snugly. These are just a little, they're just not as grippy. So they're fine, and if this is the best that I can get, that's fine, I'll wear them. But I'm interested in these no-show socks because they are, the pattern description says they are innovative low-cut socks, and they're a toe-up sock with a gusseted heel. So these are 2 other types of heels. This one, let's see, this one is a Flegel heel, and then this one is just a short row heel. So I haven't done a gusseted heel, but typically a gusseted heel does fit me pretty well. So I'm interested to see if I want to continue making maybe one of these. And the reason I made 2 different heels is because I thought, well, I'll make these 2, and then whichever one I like the fit of best, I'll just make a second one of that type. I actually ended up kind of liking both of these, so I don't really know where I would go from here. Maybe I would just make another one of each type. But if I like the no-show socks better, maybe I'll just make a couple of pairs of those. So to be continued. Hopefully I'll get started and have at least one of those no-show socks done before I podcast again, but I'm interested to see the difference. The other in progress thing I have is a tank top called the Pivot Tank. And I guess we're going with a purple theme today. So this tank top is, let's see if I can show it a little better. It's a tank top that is made in two pieces. So this is the entire front here. And it's going to have an identical piece in the back, and they're going to be trimmed with some ribbing that goes over your shoulder as a strap, and then that ribbing also goes down the back. I should probably just throw a picture from the pattern right here in the podcast so that you can see what I'm talking about. That would be easier than describing the whole thing. But I've got the front done, and then I worked a lot on the back the last couple days, so that one is probably 8 or 10, well, like, yeah, about 10 inches in. So I'm really trucking on this one. So all I really have to do is finish the back and then do the ribbing. So it might be done next time, but I think it would definitely be done by podcast number 17. So to be continued on that. That one, I'm liking that one a lot. That one is made out of Malabrigo sock in the Violetta Africana colorway. And oh, by the way, the pattern for the Pivot Tank was written for a DK weight yarn, but I had these 3 skeins of Malabrigo sock yarn, and plus it's a summer tank top. I don't want it to be a warm thing, so I decided to just adjust the numbers in the pattern and to make it out of the yarn that I had on hand. And then, because the universe likes to send me lots of hints when I'm not thinking clearly about something, my friend Janelle texted me this week and was asking me if I thought that she would be able to make a certain pattern out of, like, I don't remember, if maybe the pattern was worsted and she wanted to make it out of DK or sport or something. But anyway, she just wanted to use a different weight of yarn, and I was like, oh yeah, you can totally do that. I'll help you do the math if you need it. So we talked a little bit yesterday, and I gave her the very quick and dirty lesson on how to do the math, and she got it right away, and now she's moving right along. So I thought that actually would be a very good thing to include in the podcast, because I bet that she is not the only person out there that is a little intimidated by the thought of using yarn that is a different weight or a different gauge than the pattern is calling for. So I am here today to give you a little lesson. So a couple very quick things, and I think I probably will go more into detail on these things in later podcasts, but just a couple things to keep in mind if you are thinking about changing the type of yarn or using a different gauge than a pattern is calling for. So the first thing is, make sure that the fabric that you are going to come up with is going to be comparable to the fabric in the pattern. What I mean by that is, if you are looking at a pattern that has a worsted weight gauge of 5 stitches per inch, that's going to be a very average, typical, not real tightly woven, not real loosely woven gauge. That's going to be very average. So if you want to make it out of fingering weight yarn, don't do fingering weight yarn on a size 8 needle just to try to get that 5 stitches per inch gauge. Because then you're going to have a real droopy open weave fabric. It's not going to be at all comparable. So what you want to do is use a needle size that is similar to your new size yarn that the pattern writer was using for their type of yarn. So if they're using a size 7 on worsted weight, that's pretty average. So maybe that means you need to use like a size 3 for your fingering weight yarn. So you want to make sure that your needle sizes are in the realm of what the pattern writer had in mind for that fabric. The second thing that you need to make sure you do anytime you are trying to figure out math regarding pattern numbers is you have to, if you ever intend to wash this thing that you're making, you have got to wash it when you swatch. Well, first of all, you have to swatch. Second of all, you have to wash the swatch before you measure it. And this is another little thing. You have to swatch the way the pattern is going to be knit. So if you are going to knit something in the round, you really should swatch in the round, because a lot of people, including me, the gauge is different whether I'm knitting flat or knitting in the round. Another problem I run into, and I bet I'm not the only one, is if I swatch, if I make like a little swatch, make a little 40 stitch swatch, it is a lot tighter than if I'm doing a 300 stitch project. That's a much looser gauge. So every once in a while I will swatch that way, but then I'll automatically know, okay, whatever needle size I used for this little swatch here, I need to go down a needle size when I do my project. Otherwise, it's going to be the gauge is going to be too large. So I know that was a lot of information I just threw at you right there, and I apologize because I was not intending to throw all that in there, but I just felt like it was just things that needed to be said. Feel free to ignore those. I promise I will go into more detail on those in later podcasts, but just for now, those are your couple of little warnings. So anyway, and let's just talk about today's little lesson here. So we are going to talk about what to do if you want to use a different gauge than what your pattern is telling you. And this little lesson is going to work for scarves, shawls, mittens, hats, like anything that you want to make. It's really the same principles, really the same formula. For this little thing, I'm going to do a sweater just because that's a little more complicated and you might have more questions about it. So you can take anything that I say about this sweater and just make any sort of pattern. You can change any sort of pattern based on what I'm going to tell you here about this little sweater. So let's pretend we have a nice little sweater that we're going to make. And this is a nice little hourglass shaped sweater. So that means that the chest and the hip is the same circumference. So for this imaginary sweater that we're making, we are going to, we're going to say our size is 45 inches around. So that means the chest is 45 inches around and the hip measures 45 inches around. In this imaginary pattern, our gauge is 20 stitches by 28 rows. So maybe that's like a DK. It might be a worsted, but the rows looks a little too small for worsted. So let's say it's a DK. And if we take that down to a 1-inch gauge, it means we are doing 5 stitches per inch widthwise and 7 rows per inch vertically. Now, if you want to use a different yarn, let's pretend you have some beautiful fingering yarn that you want to use, and you did a nice swatch. And we're going to say that most of the sweater is going to be knit in the round. So you did your swatch in the round, and you bathed your swatch, you washed it, you let it dry. And when you measured it in a few different places, because you don't want to just measure your swatch in one place, you want to measure it in a few different spots to make sure you're coming up with the same number, or you're going to take the average of your numbers that you're coming up with. And let's say that your gauge is 26 stitches per 4 inches and 34 rows per 4 inches. So if we take that down to 1 inch, then you've got 6.5 stitches per inch horizontally and 8.5 rows per inch vertically. So that's kind of a big difference in the gauge, right? Now, in this pattern, because it's 45 inches around at the hip, we're going to say this is a bottom-up sweater. Your pattern says cast on 225 stitches. And if you did the math for that, you could take 225 stitches and divide it by 5, which is the pattern stitch gauge, and that would tell you that, yes, indeed, it is going to make a 45-inch around sweater. Now, if we wanted to figure out what number of stitches we need to cast on in our new gauge, we would take that 45 inches that you just came up with in the first math problem, 225 divided by 5 equals 45. Take that answer, 45 inches times your new stitch gauge, which is 6.5, and that equals 292 and a half stitches. Now, you're not obviously going to cast on a half stitch, so you need to figure out exactly what your number needs to be. So look back at the original number, which was 225, and you notice that's an odd number. So there's probably a reason that that designer made that pattern or made that number odd. So at first glance, I would say, okay, it needs to be 293 stitches instead of 292. But you might actually be starting with a ribbing pattern that's, let's say they tell you to do a knit 2, purl 1 rib. So that's a 3-stitch pattern repeat. So it might be that you need a number that's divisible by 3. Or maybe they have you do a knit 2, purl 2 repeat. So maybe your number needs to be divided by 4. So you have to look in your pattern to see what's my first thing that I need to do after I cast on, and is there a certain multiple that I need to take into consideration when I am figuring out my number. And another thing that you can do is look at all the cast on numbers for the whole pattern. If you notice, for instance, that every cast on number is like 10 stitches apart, like let's say that this pattern says one size casts on 205, the next one casts on 215, next one is 225. So if you're noticing that it's 10 stitches for each one, then I would round this one up to 295 so that it still has that same pattern. So look for patterns, see if you need to take any certain multiple into consideration, and if both of those are a no, if this is just a sweater that goes straight into stockinette stitch or garter stitch and it doesn't matter how many stitches you have, then I would just say do an even or odd number based on what the original pattern number was. So there's the formula. The pattern stitch number divided by pattern gauge, and then multiply whatever answer you come up with by your new gauge. We're talking just stitch gauges, not row gauges. Although later on we're going to talk about row gauges and it really works the same way. So your stitch number divided by pattern gauge, then multiply that answer by your new gauge. And that's the whole secret. That's it. So let's talk about a more complicated situation. So figuring out what to cast on when it's a bottom-up thing, or if it's something easier like a hat or a scarf, that's actually a really simple thing to do. It gets a little more complicated when you are talking about, well, what should I do here with this sleeve shaping, or what should I do with this neckline? Because then you're talking about, you know, a lot of different increases and decreases happening in a pretty small area. So I'm going to show you 2 ways of doing this. There's an easy way, and then there's a slightly more complicated but possibly more accurate way. So you can totally get away with the easy way. I don't want to poo-poo it, because really, like 99% of the time, easy way is going to get you close enough, and it's a knitted garment. It stretches. It forgives. You know, it has ease. So you're probably going to be fine if you use the easy way. But if you're a little bit more of a stickler, or you really are making something that's really special, that you really want it to be absolutely perfect, then go ahead and try the slightly more complicated way, because it's really not that much more complicated. So let's talk about the easy way to begin with. And I'm going to do this as a sleeve shaping, like an underarm shaping example. But like I said, the same principle applies to any sort of shaping. So the easy way to do this is that anytime you see a stitch number in the pattern, you're going to divide that number by your pattern gauge. So in this example, we're still going to use 5 stitches per inch, and then multiply whatever answer you come up with by your gauge, which we're still using the example of your new gauge is 6.5 stitches per inch. So let's take this sleeve or this underarm shaping example. A lot of times when you, if you're doing a bottom-up design, you will come to the point where the armholes are going to be bound off for, and in that first bind off row, you might have anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 20 stitches bound off on each side of the garment for the underarms. So in this example, we are going to, the pattern reads bind off 12 stitches for each armhole. So we're going to use that formula. 12 is the pattern stitch number. Divide it by your pattern stitch gauge, which is 5, and you come up with 2.4. So we take that number 2.4 and multiply it by our new stitch gauge, 6.5, and that equals 15.6. So in this example, I would round that to 16 stitches because my pattern number was 12, which is an even number, and so I'm going to round it up to 16 rather than rounding it down to 15 because I want to keep it an even number. After you decrease for an armhole, sometimes you're going to do a few more rows where you're going to bind off, say, 2 or 3 or 4 stitches, and then go to the other side, bind off 2, 3, or 4. But sometimes they're just going to do something along the lines of, after you do that initial 12-stitch bind off, now we're just going to knit a couple, knit 2 together, knit to the other side, do a slip, slip, knit, and then knit 2, and then you're at the end of the row. So what they're doing is 1 decrease on each armhole every other row. So let's say that this pattern example, they tell us to do that 6 times. So we're decreasing 12 stitches on the front and 12 stitches on the back. So 6 stitches on the front of each armhole, 6 stitches on the back of each armhole, and that's over the course of probably 12 rows. So you need to figure out, okay, instead of doing that 6 times, because probably since my gauge is different, I need to do a different amount of times. So take that number 6, divide it by your pattern gauge, which is 5, come out with 1.2, multiply 1.2 by your new gauge, 6.5, and that comes out with 7.8. So that one's really close to 8. It's not very close to 7, so I would round that one up to 8. And now, instead of decreasing 6 times at the front and the back of each armhole, I would be decreasing 8 times. So I would do a decrease every other row over 16 rows instead of over 12 rows like the pattern is telling you to do. All right, let's move on. This is a slightly more complicated way, but like I said, it's not that hard. So if you're really making something special and you want to make absolutely sure that you're doing the pattern as closely as you can to the original instructions, here's how you're going to do it. Anytime that you have an armhole or a neckline or any sort of thing, like this would work for like a pocket shaping, any sort of shaping where you have a lot of numbers coming over a short number of rows, this is what you want to do. You want to count up all the decreases or the increases, whatever you're working with, but for an armhole, we're talking decreases for a bottom-up design. So we're going to count up all the armhole decreases. And here's just a little note, neckline decreases or any other shaping would work the same way. Step 2 is to take the total number of stitches for one armhole or one neckline or one pocket or whatever and divide that number by the pattern gauge, then multiply your answer by your new stitch gauge. Step 3 would be to take your new stitch number and distribute those stitches proportionally using using the pattern instructions as your guide. So here's an example. This is how I would draw out an armhole if I was designing a garment. So I have my total number of stitches on this armhole, 28. I would divide those up so that a good chunk of them would be at the very bottom where you're binding off for the armhole. So here in the example, I've got 12 stitches down there. And then on the next 2 rows, I'm going to bind off 3 stitches on either side. So now I really, instead of having 12 stitches at that base of the armhole, I really have 18 stitches because the 2 3s plus the 12 equals 18. And then, see that 1 times 5? That is the single decreases that I'm doing on the front and the back that are just like a slip, slip, knit or a knit 2 together. So if I count up all these decreases, 5 plus 3 plus 12 plus 3 plus 5, I have 28 stitches. So remember, step 1 was to count up all your stitches for the entire underarm. So our number is 28. So we're going to take that number 28, we're going to divide it by 5 because that's our pattern stitch gauge, and that comes out to 5.6. Take 5.6, multiply it by your new gauge, which is still 6.5, and that comes out to 36.4. Now I'm going to round that down to 36, probably, instead of 37, just because when it comes to underarm shaping, even numbers are easier to work with, because that way the front of the armhole and the back of the armhole are the same. If you have to have it as an odd number, you could put that extra decrease in the back, because the back of the armhole, because most people need slightly more room in the front than they do in the back, or ladies do anyway. Well, men probably do also. So anyway, if you have to do a couple extra decreases, put them in the back of the garment. So now we have to take that number 36, which is our new total stitch number, and we have to distribute those stitches proportionally. So the way you're going to do that is by figuring out the ratio. And the way you're going to do that is by taking the stitch number. So that's 5, 3, 12 in this example. It's one of those numbers. You're going to divide that by the total stitch number, which is 28. And that's going to give you the percent of the total stitches. So for an example, 12, which is that first armhole bind off number, 12 divided by 28 is 42.8% of the total. 6, which is the 2 3s added together, 6 divided by 28 is 21.4% of the total stitch number. And those 2 5s, those single decreases on either side, add those together for 10 and divide that by 28, and you get 35.7% of the total stitch number. So these are the percents that are in the original pattern. So we're going to take those percents and we're going to figure our new numbers. So 42.8% of 36, which, remember, you just have to move the decimal 2 places to the left. Here's your junior high math review. So you would actually do 0.428 times 36, and that would tell you you want 15.4 stitches. 0.214 times 36 is 7.7 stitches, and 0.357 times 36 is 12.8 stitches. Now, you're not going to use those numbers exactly. What you're going to do probably is, instead of 15.4, just round that up to 16, because that makes it a nice, friendly, even number. And then instead of 7.7, remember we added those 2 numbers together on the second row, so we're going to make that an even number also, so it's easy to divide. So round that up to 8, divide it in half, and you're going to bind off 4 stitches on either side of the 16. And then the last number, 12.8, we're just going to round that down to 12, because we've rounded the last 2 numbers up, so we probably have to round this one down to 12. And plus, that makes it nice and even so that we can divide it evenly, and we'll do 6 single decreases as like a knit 2 together or a slip slip knit on either side of the armhole, and that's going to be over the course of probably 12 rows, because you're going to do it every other row. So if you add up all those numbers, 6 plus 4 plus 16 plus 4 plus 6, you come out with 36. And remember, that was the number that we were trying to get. So when you check your math, if you come out with the number you're trying to get, then you're a genius. And if you don't come out with that number, it's okay. You're probably still a genius. What you want to do is just kind of fudge those numbers. It's okay to fudge it a little bit. You'll probably just have to, add or subtract 1 or 2 stitches from something in order to come out with your total number. But the important thing is that you do come out with the total number that you figured out in steps 1, 2, and 3 of this little tricky formula thing. So one more time, the basic formula that you need to change your gauge if you're going to use a different weight of yarn is the pattern stitch number divided by their pattern gauge, we're talking stitches per inch in this example, take that answer and multiply it by your stitch gauge. So if you want to be fancy, let's say pattern stitch number divided by pattern stitch gauge equals Z. I don't know why it's Z, I just made that up. Then the answer, Z, times your stitch gauge equals your stitch number that you're trying to figure out. So, is that a lot? I know it seems like a lot. I just tried to give you a lot of examples to walk you through it a few times, but really all you need to write down is that formula. Because if you have the pattern number and the pattern gauge, and then your new gauge, those are the only three numbers you need in order to figure out how to change your numbers to use your new yarn. And like I kind of hinted at this before, I was just using horizontal stitch gauge for these examples, but using row gauge works the exact same way, taking the number of rows that the pattern is telling you to do. Like, let's say that you're doing some pattern that's telling you knit 30 rows. Well, take that 30 rows, divide it by your pattern row gauge, multiply it by your new row gauge, and that will tell you how many rows in your new yarn you have to do instead of 30. It's probably, if you're using a smaller yarn, it's going to be more rows. If you're using a thicker yarn, it's going to be less rows. So this is the formula you need for any sort of modification regarding gauge. Ta-da! Now you're a genius. Now you're ready to use any kind of yarn you like. And we will talk a little bit more in future podcasts about good substitutes and things to keep in mind when you are not going to use the yarn that is called for in the pattern, because I know that's another thing that, some people probably feel like, oh yeah, I can substitute yarn pretty easily. And some people that is probably terrifying and you feel like, oh, I'm going to mess this up. I don't know if this is a good substitute. I can help you with that. So in the future, we'll try to have some more helpful lessons. So let me know, was that helpful? Is that something that you didn't know how to do, or something that was really intimidating? Are you still super intimidated, or are you a little bit less intimidated now? Do you feel like just using that formula, do you feel like now maybe that's something that you would be willing to give a try? So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. So I think last time I podcasted, I was talking about a book that I was about halfway through at that time. It was called Glory Over Everything, and it's the sequel to The Kitchen House by Kathleen Grissom. And I loved The Kitchen House, and I really enjoyed Glory Over Everything as well. And the last, let's say 10% of this book, I think they were setting us up for another sequel because, well, I don't want to do any spoilers, but let's just say that the two little girls, wouldn't that be a good story? Two little girls, different lives, kind of the same life, but obviously they're going to have a different experience in the world. So I think I can look forward to another sequel to this series, because I think that would be a really good story. So if there isn't a series or a sequel currently being written, Kathleen Grissom, you got to write that book, because I want to know about these little girls. So I would highly recommend either or both of those books. You don't have to necessarily read The Kitchen House first, but I think it is slightly the better book, so I would recommend that one first. And then once you read that, you're totally going to want to read any sequels, because you're going to love that book so much. One last little note was that in the last podcast, I was telling you about my weird purchase of an Amazon Dash button. And Jane from Florida sent me a little note asking me if I had heard of this website called Chewy.com, because I think I mentioned in that podcast that the other thing that I hate buying at the store is kitty litter. And she was telling me that on this Chewy.com website, kitty litter is, well, it's like a pet supply website, which, no, I had not heard of it. So thank you so much for letting me know. It's a pet supply website, and kitty litter is one of the things they sell. So I was looking to see if they have my kitty litter, and they do, I think, but it was called, so I like to use this Tidy Cat multi-cat litter. It comes in a yellow bucket with a red lid. And on the website, they had a white bucket with a red lid that kind of seemed like it was maybe the same thing, except it was called lightweight litter. And instead of being a 35-pound bucket like I buy at, Target or Walmart, they said that it's half the weight, so it's a 17-pound bucket, but I think it's the same size. It's just somehow it's lighter weight. But then that made me wonder, well, what are they putting in there? What is it like? I don't know, styrofoam? Is it styrofoam balls in with the clay? Because that's not going to absorb anything. So I'm very curious. Has anyone used Chewy.com, or has anyone used lightweight Tidy Cat litter? Because I am very tempted to order from this website because the prices were really very reasonable. And if you do a $49 order, they don't charge shipping. So, I mean, hey, if I ordered 4 buckets of litter, that would get me to the limit and they would just show up on my porch. So that's a very exciting idea. But I'm not really sure about this whole lightweight litter thing. And they didn't have exactly the Tidy Cat regular multi-cat litter that I order. So that's not an option on that website. But I'm very interested. So if you know anything about Chewy.com, or if you have used lightweight litter, do they even sell that in the store? Honestly, my husband has been the litter purchaser in our family for so long now that I haven't even walked down the cat litter aisle of the store. So I am curious if that is something that they sell in regular stores, or if you have ordered it off the internet. I want to know about it. So please leave a comment, or if you don't want to leave a comment, you could send me a personal message on Ravelry or on my website. All my contact info is at the end of the podcast, so I'm very easy to get a hold of. Jane said that she thought that it was a weird thing to leave as a comment on the YouTube video. You can totally leave comments like that on the YouTube video. Tell me all about the other websites that I need to know about, and then that way other people can know about it too. So don't be afraid to leave comments on the YouTube video or to email me privately or whatever. I'm always happy to hear from people who are listening or who have something to say. So I don't know about in your neighborhood, but in our neighborhood, back to school is coming up. My kid, well, actually my freshman is at the high school right now because it's freshman orientation day. And so they go back to school for real on Tuesday. So if your kids have already started or are about to start, whatever your situation is, I hope that you are enjoying this last little bit of summer. And I hope that everybody has a good back to school season. And from the uptick that I've seen in my Ravelry account, I think it's back to knitting too. I think people are getting back into it. There's been a little uptick in pattern purchases. So I hope that you have some new projects on your needles, and I hope that you are enjoying getting back into knitting. So I think that's it. I hope you have a great couple weeks, and I will see you later. Bye!